Hey everyone, I'm Robert Bennett. I'm running for Congress in North Carolina's 2nd Congressional District, and welcome to my new YouTube series, The Policy Lab. This is where we'll talk about some of my key public policy proposals as part of my campaign, and I want to make these educational so that you can learn from them, and hopefully we can see these policy solutions implemented one day. The first one we're going to talk about in this series is something that I've been very high on and been planning for a while now as part of this campaign, and that's proportional representation. So let me just give you a quick overview and then we'll go over some PowerPoint slides. So right now the US has a winner-take-all system. What that means is if you run for Congress or even for a state general assembly race or even local government races, there's only one winner in almost every race you see. So for District 2, if I win, whether it's the primary or the general, or whether the Republican wins, that is the only party that gets a seat in Congress out of that race. You have just crazy gerrymandering, you have crazy polarization going on, you have a lot of issues with the winner-take-all system, and we'll go over some of those here today. Whereas what most democracies around the world actually use, especially in places like Europe, is something called proportional representation. Now, just to kind of briefly sum up what that would be, say there's one congressional race, but here's the thing, it's not winner take all for one person, it's multiple winners based on a percentage or based on the proportion of voters. So let's say you have a Congress district. We'll pick District 2, since that's what I'm running for. Well, if I win 51% of the votes, but the Republican wins 30%, and some other party or even an independent candidate wins 30%, 20 to 30%, something like that, then each of those three would get representatives. So if I win 50%, the Democrats would get 2 representatives in Congress. If the Republican wins 30%, they would get probably just 1. And if another group wins about 30% of the vote, then they would get 1 as well. The details vary on exactly how it works. Some of them use ranked choice voting. Some of them do things a little bit differently, depending on, what country in the world or what race it is. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it is simply my proposed solution to gerrymandering and polarization, because these are issues that are just plaguing the country as we speak, and neither major side, Democrats or Republicans both, have really had a solution to gerrymandering. All they've done is just try to gerrymander the maps further, and no one wants to see that, especially if you're an unaffiliated or independent voter. So that's what it is in a nutshell. Let's go over some of the key details. All right, guys. So I just want to use this PowerPoint presentation as a chance to really explain some of the nitty-gritty details about how proportional representation works. Probably the best place to start is simply with a visual and a couple explainers about it. All right. So, like I mentioned previously, say it's a 6-seat district. If a party's candidate wins 51% of that vote, they'd be expected to win 3 out of the 6 seats rather than 100% of the seats, as is currently the case under the current winner-take-all system. And the result is that most groups tend to have at least one elected official representing their viewpoint in government. Now, I did include this visual of more House seats and different types of parties. You got things like New Liberal, Patriot, Growth and Opportunity Party. Excuse me. This really is just an illustration of how it could work. These don't have to be the parties. You could actually, believe it or not, still have Democrats and Republicans both, in Congress. It's just that there are either A, more parties, or B, even a mix of unaffiliated uh, members of Congress that now occupy the US House, as opposed to just two parties and two parties only. So it could it could be one party or another. The name of the party really doesn't matter. What matters under proportional representation, and with the sake of this visual, is that everyone finds a voice by a candidate that represents them, so long as they win enough of a percentage of the vote to have a candidate in Congress. That's essentially how it works in a nutshell. I also want to give just another, statewide visualization of it. So this is Massachusetts. This is a state that in much of the research I did on proportional representation came up quite a bit, where right now there's actually a percentage of Republicans in that state that basically have no representation, even though they equate to about 30% of the registered voters in that state. Oklahoma is another state just the other way around. So Oklahoma has about 30 to 40% of its registered voters as Democrats, but they don't even, I think at best they have one Democrat in the state. Really, it's more like zero because of the way the maps are drawn, basically. What happens with proportional representation is the maps don't matter as much because as long as you win a proportion of the votes, you still get a member of Congress that represents you. So, under the current system, like I mentioned, you have districts that are just Democrats in each and every one, even though the Republican voters are mixed throughout it. Under proportional representation, that would look different. You might have one district like the one here that has basically multiple members per district. And that is a bit of a changing of thinking of what we have now. Again, you have multiple members per district. That is a key to how proportional representation works. We'll talk more about increasing the number of representatives in the House in just a moment. But in one district, you can have a Democrat, a Republican, and say a Green Party candidate or some other party candidate, and then the same thing in a couple of other districts, multi-member districts, and multiple representatives to represent each political side. So that's the real key to understanding how this works is it's not just one party representing each district. It's multiple parties or representatives really per district. I want to make sure I repeat that so that it's clear to everyone who's watching this. Now, let's start with just kind of the blunt, fundamental question that's being addressed by this, and something that is a key platform of my campaign. Should we break up the two-party system? Why? What sort of problems does proportional representation solve? The answer is that it solves a lot of problems. But I do want to take the time here to talk about the key problems that it addresses and why. It, like I mentioned a moment ago, it provides representation to namely unaffiliated voters, but also just people who want other political parties. And I'm a Democrat. My bias is not going away, guys. I don't even want to switch parties, believe it or not. But we have to acknowledge the fact that there are people on the other side of the aisle. There are people who are fed up with politics. And this is a way to give them a voice, which leads me to my next point, which is this would increase representation and lead to less polarization and more bipartisanship. Bipartisanship, I know it's something that kind of gets thrown around a lot, but it really is a key to doing democracy the right way because the reality is you never always get everything you want in politics, no matter who you are, because that's just how democracy works. And more importantly, it more closely matches what the changing demographics of voters are around the country, and especially in the state of North Carolina. A lot of people don't know that in North Carolina, unaffiliated voters now outrank Republican voters and are either nearly or slightly ahead of Democrats in our state. That is also the case in nearly 30 other states. The exact numbers of which party is in front or not may vary depending on which state you look at, but in other words, about 30% of the registered voters in most states are, a Democrat. Uh, some of them, 30% of them are Republican, and then either the majority or close to 30% of them in many states are unaffiliated. They don't have a party. They frankly don't have representatives for them. And so this is something that needs to be addressed because we want everyone to find representation. And something that's really important is just to note that political violence has been on the rise in this country because of polarization, because of the what I like to call the us versus them mentality. And basically what that is in the context of political parties, it's always the Republican Party trying to destroy the Democratic Party, or the Democratic Party trying to destroy the Republican Party. And if you have any doubts about that, you can just go look at their rhetoric. You can look at their social media posts and their statements, and they will all reflect this type of thinking. And as much as I am a Democrat, we have to be honest about how us versus them thinking is detrimental for everyone, no matter what side of the political aisle you are on. And it fosters polarization and political violence, which is obviously very dangerous. Proportional representation helps to reduce that. I don't want to say solves it, because nothing's ever a magic bullet, but it helps reduce political violence because you can find a representative for you, no matter who you are. Um, Another reason is constituent services across the country. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's basically just some of the day to day office work that members of Congress do to help their constituents. It's largely out of hand. Many of them are overworked. They can't process all the claims and things like that. So, proportional representation would mean more reps for every district. Or, as we'll talk about in a moment, you can increase the number of representatives in the House. And as a result, you have more constituent services work that can actually get done as opposed to it just never being done like it is in some cases now. And look, like I've said, there's always political bias. You're never going to stop that. But whoever you are, whether you're a liberal like me, whether you're a moderate, or dare I say, even a conservative, if you're a registered voter, you deserve a representative for you. So proportional representation does just that. It gives you a representative for your interest. Most importantly, and you may have already picked up on this, but it renders gerrymandering a moot point because even if a district is drawn to favor one party or the other, as long as there's still enough voters in that district, you can still find a representative. So, going back to the analogy I've used for a while, or for the last few minutes of this video, is if one party in a district wins 51% of the votes, they do win more representatives under proportional representation. But if the minority party, whoever that is, doesn't matter who they are, wins something like 30% of the votes, 30% of the overall votes, then they still get a representative in that district. So that is how it renders gerrymandering, frankly, a moot point. Now, there are still some keys to making sure that proportional representation is done correctly. Like I've mentioned before, just increasing the number of US House of Representatives seats is really key, especially with regard to constituent services, so that the staff in Congress don't get overworked. And a lot of people don't know that the number of representatives in the U.S. House has basically remained flat for close to 100 years. Under the Permanent Apportionment Act, excuse me, of 1929, that fixed the number of U.S. House reps at 435. As you can see with the graphic here, the total US population has basically skyrocketed since then. I don't think there are many people walking today that were around in 1929. So if we really want to make sure that, proportional representation is done right, and making sure that the number of reps increases is vital. And you can actually see, it's kind of hard to see the yearly marks, but again, this 435 number was set at during 1929, but before then the number was lower, and obviously it increased with the U.S. population, but it has not been increasing with the U.S. population since then. So that's a major issue that needs to be addressed. A couple other keys I want to touch on, at least briefly, to making sure proportional representation works for everyone correctly is first, if you have doubts about can this be done, I can confidently say it can, because all you would need to change up the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929 and some of the other laws that would allow for this is a simple majority in both chambers of Congress and a wet presidential signature or a veto override. So there's nothing stopping this from passing Congress right now. You don't need a constitutional amendment or anything like that. I also need to mention there is a select committee in the U.S. House of Representatives as we speak to explore options for electoral reform, including proportional representation. But quite frankly, no one knows about it and no one talks about it. Now, why they don't talk about it, I will let you be the judge of that. But that select committee is looking at several solutions, if you will, for increasing democracy and voting rights in the country. If I had to pick one committee to be the most important in Congress right now, that select committee to explore these options and proportional representation both is probably the most important one in the country. And again, no one is talking about it. We also would need to repeal the Uniform Congressional District Act. This basically is a law that says that you have to have single member districts for U.S. House of Representatives. If we repeal this act, then we can basically start implementing proportional representation. There are some nuances as to how it would be implemented in each state. We're not going to talk about that too much this video because that's its own discussion. But another thing, kind of along those lines, is we need to make sure that attorney generals still have the ability to file civil suits based on what those maps look like. As much as proportional representation renders gerrymandering largely a moot point, maps can still play a factor in what the final number of members in Congress looks like. It's just that everyone has a representative regardless. But making sure that attorney generals can have a role to, file civil suits and make sure the maps are fair is still very important. One of the last things I want to do is just give an example of some sample ballots, because it's one thing to talk about all of this on a whiteboard or a paper, but seeing an example of how the ballot would look is really important. And proportional representation has been done in several countries around the globe. It is arguably the standard for democracy, whereas the US, frankly, does not meet that standard. Example of how that could look in a moment. But again, you have multiple options under each party, and you can basically choose which one or ones you want. So that's one way you could do proportional representation. Another way
is basically to just vote for the party, not for the candidate. So you would, under this scenario, you would basically have the ability to vote for just one party, and that party, either through their primary or otherwise, has picked, which of their top candidates you would be voting for. Another example of how it works, and this is one I probably lean most in favor of, um, is a single transferable vote. So, in other words, you're ranking candidate choices across the ballot, and you can rank as many candidates as you'd like in the order of your preference. So, you would have choice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You go all the way up to 6 in this example. Each candidate could be one party or another, but the emphasis in a single transferable vote is less so on the party, but asking you, what are your preferred choices? Maybe it's one candidate, maybe it's a second, and they have another candidate that is your second choice, and so forth. Um, Pretty straightforward there, but those are just a couple of the ways that you could do proportional representation. And also like to just take a moment to acknowledge another thing I've been working on, which is basically a proportional representation memorandum of understanding with the goal of building support to get enough votes in Congress to pass a bill for proportional representation. This is a goal for me as a candidate of Congress, is to see proportional representation passed in the law. It's one of the biggest priorities of my campaign. But the ability to build support around proportional representation already exists because the proportions of voters that basically don't have a voice right now is already out there in close to 30 states, like I mentioned earlier in this presentation. So it's not too late to have the right people work together to implement proportional representation. And you can read more about that on my Substack blog post about proportional representation. Um, I frankly would love for you to go read that. I might do another video on that here on YouTube in the future. But thank you for watching, everyone. I hope this helps to connect the dots and explain what proportional representation is. I cannot stress enough how important proportional representation is to not only fixing our democracy, but making sure that people, minority voters, whether by their identity or political affiliation, find a representative for them. It really does solve a lot of issues that has plagued American democracy for several decades. And it's something that we know can work because it works well in several other democracies around the world. And it does a great job of building coalitions and bipartisanship as opposed to just screaming and yelling at each other all day, like you see in the current winner take all system.
Thank you so much for watching this video. If you'd like to learn more about my campaign, you can donate at robertfornc.com. You can follow me here on YouTube. You can follow me on, Facebook, Instagram, and other social media platforms. We're going to use Substack a lot for our blog post and volunteer updates, so make sure you're following me there. Or you can sign up for our Substack email list at robertfornc.com. Again, your help, whether it's a donation, whether it's volunteering, or whether it's simply just sharing the word with as many people as you can, goes a long way to making this campaign a reality and a long way to helping us win and beat the establishment. All right, so thank you so much for watching. I hope to get your support and your vote come March 3rd, 2026.